The storm came without warning that Christmas Eve in the Norwegian mountains, transforming the quiet forest into a howling wilderness of white. Inside a remote cabin, the Lund family huddled around a crackling fireplace, grateful for the warmth. Father Lars, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, nursed a glass of aquavit while his daughter Ingrid, 28, scrolled through her phone hoping for a signal that never came. Her younger brother Eric played solitaire at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing at the windows where the snow piled higher by the minute. They had come here to escape the chaos of Oslo, to reconnect as a family after their mother's death 2 decades ago had torn them apart. The cabin held memories, some warm, some buried deep. Around 11 that night, a desperate pounding on the door shattered the quiet. Lars grabbed a fireplace poker and approached cautiously. When he opened the door, a man collapsed inside, his body trembling violently from hypothermia. He wore only a thin sweater and jeans, completely inadequate for the freezing temperatures. His lips were blue, his skin pale as the snow itself. The family dragged him to the fire, wrapped him in blankets, and forced warm broth between his chattering teeth. When he finally regained enough coherence to speak, he looked around the cabin with confused, terrified eyes. He couldn't remember his name. He couldn't remember where he came from. He couldn't remember anything at all. Over the next 24 hours, the stranger recovered slowly, though his memory remained a blank slate. The family called him Jonas, a generic name he accepted without complaint. He was grateful for their kindness, but something bothered him deeply. As he moved around the cabin, certain objects triggered strange sensations he couldn't explain. The wooden clock above the fireplace made his chest tighten. The photograph of a woman on the mantel made his eyes water without understanding why. He found himself staring at rooms he had never seen before, yet somehow knew the exact location of the bathroom in the dark. On the second night, while eating dinner, he suddenly dropped his fork and gripped the table. A flash of memory hit him like a physical blow. He saw a woman with blonde hair screaming. He saw flames consuming wooden walls. He saw blood on a kitchen floor. The vision disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving him breathless and shaking. Ingrid noticed his distress and asked what happened. When Jonas described the woman, her face went white. Blonde hair, blue eyes, a small mole above her lip. She described her mother. The same mother who had died in a cabin fire 20 years ago. The same mother whose photograph hung on their mantel. Jonas had never seen that photograph before collapsing by their fire. There was no possible way he could describe her accurately. Unless he had seen her before. Unless he had known her. Unless he was not a stranger at all. The story of the mother's death was a wound the Lund family never fully healed. Her name was Astrid, and she died in September of 1999 when a faulty electrical wire sparked a fire that consumed their old cabin completely. That was the official explanation from the investigators who combed through the ashes. Lars had been in Oslo for work. Ingrid, only 8 at the time, was staying with grandparents. Eric was just 5. They returned to find nothing but charred ruins and a grief that would shape their entire lives. The original cabin had been rebuilt on the same spot, a decision Lars made to honor his wife's memory, though some whispered it was a morbid choice. Jonas listened to this story with growing unease. The flashes in his mind intensified. He saw the old cabin now, not the rebuilt one. He saw Astrid arguing with someone, her face twisted with anger and fear. He saw a man's hands on her shoulders, shoving her hard against the kitchen counter. Then smoke, then flames, then darkness. He didn't share these visions with the family yet. Something held him back, a primal instinct that told him to wait, to watch, to remember more before speaking. But Eric noticed how Jonas avoided looking directly at Lars. How his hands trembled whenever Lars entered the room. How he flinched when Lars raised his voice, even in harmless frustration. The stranger was remembering something terrible, and that something involved the father of this family. On the third day, the storm intensified, trapping them all inside with nowhere to go. Boredom and cabin fever drove Ingrid to explore the attic, a cramped space filled with boxes from their old life. She found baby clothes, old books, and a dusty album of photographs from before the fire. She brought it downstairs and spread the pictures across the dining table, inviting everyone to look. Jonas approached reluctantly, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. The first few pages showed happy family moments, birthdays and holidays, Astrid smiling at the camera. Then Jonas turned a page and froze. It was a photograph of a young man, perhaps 18 years old, standing next to Astrid at what looked like a graduation ceremony. The young man had the same eyes Jonas saw in the mirror every morning. The same jawline. The same posture. Lars noticed his reaction and walked over. "Oh," he said quietly. "That's our oldest son. Thomas." He would have been 38 now. Ingrid and Eric looked confused. Oldest son? They had never heard of a brother. Lars sighed heavily and explained that Thomas had died in the fire too. He was 18, home from university for the weekend when the cabin burned. His body was never recovered, but the investigators assumed he was caught in the worst part of the blaze. Jonas stared at the photograph, at his own face staring back from 20 years ago. He was Thomas Lund. He was the dead son. And he was standing in his family's cabin with no memory of who they were. The revelation shattered the fragile peace of the cabin. Ingrid burst into tears, torn between joy that her brother lived and horror that she hadn't recognized him. Eric backed away, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. Lars simply stared, his expression unreadable, a mix of emotions playing across his weathered features. Jonas, or Thomas, or whoever he was now, sat heavily in a chair and pressed his palms against his temples, willing more memories to surface. They came in fragments, disjointed and unreliable. He remembered sneaking out of the cabin that night to meet a girl in the forest. He remembered arguing with his mother earlier that day about his plans to drop out of university. He remembered walking back toward the cabin and seeing orange flames against the night sky. He remembered running, screaming, trying to get inside. Then nothing. 40 years of nothing until he woke in a hospital bed in a town he didn't recognize, with no identification, no memories, and no one to claim him. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, likely triggered by extreme trauma. They gave him a new name, Elias, and he started a new life. He became a carpenter, moved from town to town, always feeling like something was missing, always dreaming of fire. Now, 40 years later, something had drawn him back to this mountain, to this cabin, to the family he forgot he had. But as the initial shock subsided, a darker question emerged. If he survived, why did no one look for him? Why was he declared dead? And why did he feel, deep in his gut, that the fire was no accident? That night, no one slept. Thomas sat by the fireplace, watching flames dance behind the glass door, trying to force his mind back to September 1999. Ingrid joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She was only 8 when he disappeared, but she remembered him vaguely, a tall teenager who sometimes played with her, sometimes ignored her. She asked him what he remembered about their mother. Thomas closed his eyes and let the images come. He remembered Astrid as warm and loving, but also fiercely protective. She had arguments with Lars often, usually about money, usually late at night when they thought the children slept. The argument on the day of the fire was different though. It was about him, about Thomas dropping out of university. Lars had been furious, calling him lazy and ungrateful. Astrid defended him, and the fight escalated. Thomas had stormed out to clear his head, meeting his girlfriend in the forest, staying gone for hours. When he returned, the cabin was burning. He tried to run inside, but the heat drove him back. He heard screaming, his mother's screaming, and then nothing. Ingrid listened with tears streaming down her face. She had always been told the fire was an accident, a tragic random event. But the way Thomas described the argument, the timing, the intensity, it painted a different picture. She looked toward the master bedroom where Lars slept. For the first time in her life, she wondered if her father's story held the whole truth. The next morning, she decided to find out. While Lars and Eric chopped wood outside, Ingrid pulled Thomas aside and whispered her plan. She remembered something from childhood, a loose floorboard in their parents' bedroom where her mother sometimes hid special things. If anyone had secrets, that's where they would be. The two of them slipped into the master bedroom and knelt by the old wooden floor. Ingrid ran her fingers along the boards until she found one that gave slightly under pressure. With a knife from the kitchen, she pried it up. Beneath was a small cavity, and inside, a metal box coated in dust. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. The box wasn't locked, just held shut by a rusted latch. Inside, they found letters, photographs, and a manila envelope sealed with tape. The photographs showed Lars with people they didn't recognize, men in suits, women in expensive clothes, all in settings far removed from their simple mountain life. The letters were from a lawyer, discussing payments and property transfers. But the envelope contained the real bombshell. It was an insurance policy on the old cabin, taken out just 3 months before the fire. The payout was substantial, nearly 2 million kroner. And the beneficiary was Lars Lund. Ingrid looked at Thomas with horror dawning in her eyes. Their father had insured the cabin for a fortune right before it burned. Their mother died in that fire. Their brother was presumed dead. And Lars collected every penny. The man they trusted, the man who raised them, had motive. Now they needed proof. That evening, Ingrid confronted her father directly. She placed the metal box on the dining table and watched his face transform from confusion to shock to something darker. Lars demanded to know where she found it, then tried to laugh it off, calling it old business, nothing important. But Thomas stepped forward, and something in Lars's eyes shifted when he saw his eldest son, the son he thought dead, looking at him with accusation. Thomas spoke calmly, describing the argument he remembered, the fire, the insurance money. He asked the question that had haunted him since childhood, even in his amnesiac state. "Did you set that fire? Did you kill our mother?" Lars exploded with rage, denying everything, calling Thomas an imposter, a fraud who somehow learned their family history to steal from them. But his anger felt performative, desperate. Eric stood frozen, unsure who to believe. Ingrid wept. And then Lars made a mistake. He grabbed the fireplace poker, the same one he held when Thomas first appeared at the door, and pointed it at his eldest son. "Get out," he screamed. "Get out of my house." Thomas didn't move. Instead, he looked at Lars with an expression of profound sadness. "You've been lying for 40 years, he said quietly. "But I remember everything now. I remember coming back to the cabin that night. I saw you through the window. You were arguing with Mother. You pushed her. Then you left. Minutes later, the fire started. You didn't know I was outside. You didn't know I saw. Lars dropped the poker. His face crumpled. And in that moment, everyone knew the truth. The storm outside mirrored the chaos inside as Lars Lund finally broke. He sank into a chair, his strong frame collapsing like a building undermined for decades. The confession came in fragments, sometimes defensive, sometimes self-pitying, but undeniably true. He hadn't meant to kill Astrid, he insisted. They argued about Thomas dropping out, about money, about everything wrong in their marriage. She threatened to leave him, to take the children, to expose his financial schemes to the authorities. He pushed her, harder than intended. She fell, hit her head on the kitchen counter, and lay still. Panic consumed him. He checked her pulse, found nothing, and made a terrible decision. The fire would cover everything. He started it in the basement, made it look electrical, then drove to a pay phone and called the fire department from miles away, pretending to be a neighbor who spotted smoke. He never expected Thomas to be outside. He never expected anyone to survive. When investigators found no body matching Thomas, Lars assumed his son ran away, too traumatized to return. He reported him dead anyway, collected the insurance, and rebuilt his life on a foundation of lies. For 40 years, he lived with the secret, telling himself it was an accident, telling himself Astrid's death wasn't murder. But deep down, he always knew. And when Thomas appeared at his door in the storm, Lars felt the walls of his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. He had spent 4 decades running from that night, and now it had found him. The confession hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and inescapable. Ingrid's sobs filled the cabin while Eric stood paralyzed, his entire understanding of his life shattered. Thomas felt no satisfaction in being right, only an overwhelming grief for the mother he lost twice, once to fire and once to truth. The question of what to do next pressed upon them all. The storm continued raging, cutting them off from the outside world, from police, from justice. They were trapped with a murderer. Lars seemed to shrink physically, his guilt transforming him from a commanding presence into a broken old man. He didn't resist when Thomas took the fireplace poker and moved it away. He didn't argue when Ingrid demanded he stay in his bedroom. He simply nodded and walked slowly down the hallway, pausing at the door to look back at his children. "I did love her," he said quietly. "I loved all of you. That's what made it so easy to lie." Then he closed the door and left them alone with their shattered world. The night stretched endlessly, each of them lost in private grief and horror. Thomas sat by the fire, watching flames that now held new meaning. Ingrid stared at the photograph of her mother, wondering how she never saw the truth. Eric paced, angry and confused, mourning a father who died twice, once tonight and once 40 years ago when he chose deception over confession. Dawn broke gray and cold, but the storm had finally passed. Sunlight reflected off the fresh snow, creating a world of brilliant white that seemed determined to erase the darkness of the night before. Thomas was the first to check on Lars. He knocked on the bedroom door, received no answer, and entered slowly. His father lay on the bed, dressed in his best clothes, the same suit he wore to Astrid's funeral decades ago. In his hands, he clutched a photograph of his wife, the one from the mantel. He was dead. Beside him on the nightstand sat an empty bottle of sleeping pills and a handwritten letter addressed to his children. Thomas called Ingrid and Eric, and together they read their father's final words. He wrote of his love for them, twisted and damaged as it was. He wrote of the guilt that had eaten him for 40 years, the dreams of Astrid's face, the sound of fire consuming his conscience. He wrote that seeing Thomas alive was both a miracle and a judgment, proof that truth always finds its way through even the deepest snow. He couldn't face prison, couldn't face his children's hatred played out in courtrooms and newspapers. This was his only escape, his final act of cowardice. Ingrid wept for the father she lost twice. Eric felt nothing but emptiness. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. Justice, he thought, had come in its own terrible way. The local police arrived 2 days later when the roads finally cleared. The investigation was thorough but straightforward. Lars Lund's suicide note, combined with Thomas's testimony and the evidence in the metal box, painted a complete picture of the 1999 fire. The insurance documents, the lawyer letters, the timing of the policy, all confirmed what Thomas remembered. The official cause of Astrid Lund's death was changed from accidental to homicide. Thomas provided a DNA sample that matched his childhood medical records, confirming his identity beyond doubt. The story made national news, a 40-year mystery solved by a storm and a stranger who turned out to be family. Ingrid and Eric struggled to process everything. They had lost their mother, gained a brother, and buried a father who was both victim and villain. The cabin, once a place of family retreat, became a monument to betrayal. They decided to sell it, to use the proceeds for something positive, perhaps a foundation in their mother's name. Thomas agreed to stay in Norway, to rebuild relationships with siblings who were strangers, to finally live as himself after 40 years as a ghost. The process would be slow, painful, and uncertain, but for the first time since the fire, he felt something he couldn't name. Perhaps it was peace. Perhaps it was simply the end of running. Spring arrived in the mountains, melting the snow and revealing the green world beneath. Thomas stood before 2 graves in the small cemetery outside town. One headstone read Astrid Lund, beloved mother, 1950 to 1999. The dates had been updated to reflect the truth of her death. Beside it, a newer stone marked Lars Lund, 1948 to 2019, with no epitaph, no loving words, just his name and dates. Ingrid and Eric had chosen silence over lies. Thomas placed white roses on both graves, one for the mother who loved him, one for the father who destroyed everything. He didn't know what he felt anymore. Grief, certainly. Anger, still. But also something like acceptance. He had spent 40 years as a man without a past, and now he had a history, complicated and painful as it was. Ingrid joined him, slipping her hand into his. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Eric waited by the car, giving them space. In the distance, the mountains rose against the clear blue sky, ancient and indifferent to human drama. Thomas thought about the stranger who appeared at a cabin door in a blizzard, a man with no name and no memory. That man was gone now, replaced by someone real, someone with a family, a history, a truth. It wasn't a happy ending, not really. But it was an ending, and sometimes that was enough. He turned from the graves, walked toward his siblings, and drove away from the past, carrying it with him but no longer trapped inside it. The storm had passed, and spring had finally come.